Eyes in the fog. On the moss-covered, grayish-blue stone highlands of northern America, an October morning began with a thick fog, as dense as watered-down milk. The sun was still trapped behind the Appalachian Mountains, and only the thinnest rays, like needles of light, managed to pierce through the tree canopy, waking up the last few red maple leaves still clinging to the branches. The winding mountain road was empty, like a corridor leading into another realm, somewhere time itself seemed to have fallen asleep. A truck engine roared through the silence. A lone silver Jeep crawled along the damp, mist-slicked road, inching forward through the sleepy and chilly wilderness. Moisture collected into a thin layer on the windshield. Inside the cabin, the heater blew warm air, a sharp contrast to the ghostly world outside. And then, like a sudden scratch across the screen, the headlights cut through the fog and stopped cold. Right in the middle of the road, a small, solitary figure stood frozen, a red fox, but it was not the typical crouching, swift stance of a fox. It stood still, completely unmoving, like a living statue carved from the first winter wind. Its tail fluffed out like a snow broom, its legs thin and slight but steady, its head raised with ears perked, as if listening to every vibration in the air. And its eyes, those eyes pierced right through the glass, through the light beams, through the invisible boundary between the human and the wild. Those eyes looked straight into the driver's, not with fear, not with wariness, searching for an escape, but with a look, as if silently calling someone's name. No movement, no sound. The world seemed frozen in that instant. Just the fox standing there, and that gaze wrapped in fog, lingering like a fingerprint on the window of the soul. David, the man behind the wheel, did not slam the brakes. He just breathed slower, his chest tightening, as if something greater than himself had entered that moment. A wildlife photographer, he had seen hundreds of creatures, from Serengeti lions to northern snow owls, but never, not once, had he encountered a being that looked at him like that. The headlight reflection in the fox's eyes did not shine with fear. It shimmered with something more, like a question, a wordless plea, a lone note from a symphony yet to be written. A few seconds passed, then a few more. A gentle breeze stirred the fox's fur, like the earth itself was trembling in anticipation. Then suddenly, it turned. It did not flee. It did not vanish. It walked, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly where it needed to go. It stepped off the road, through the low shrubs, and faded into the quiet woods beyond. But before its form disappeared completely, it stopped. It looked back. Once more, those eyes met David's through the windshield. Once more, not the eyes of a wild animal, but of a soul hoping to be understood. Then it moved on, leaving behind only a swirl of fog, like a scarf slipping from a woman's shoulders in a silent film. And David, the man who had crossed the Amazon, Siberia, and Africa, for the first time felt he was no longer the one in control, but the one being guided, by a gaze, by a mystery, by an invitation that had no voice. He opened the car door, not to check, not out of fear, but as if his name had just been called, by his own heart. Awakened by a pair of eyes in the mist, something had begun, in the silence, a story beyond language, a meeting where nature, not man, led the way. Down in Allure, the forest wind rustled softly, like the first breath of a woodland just awakening. Fern fronds swayed under David's dew-damp boots as he walked slowly, eyes fixed on the tiny footprints pressed into the moist earth, twisting trails that looked like a child's scribble, yet carried a clear sense of purpose. The fox had not vanished, as he had expected. It was still there, not far, sometimes just the flick of a red tail behind an oak trunk, sometimes a lightning-quick glance before melting back into the trees. David had never seen a fox like this. Wild animals usually hid, hypersensitive to noise, always wary of humans. But this fox, it was not afraid. It was neither frantic nor skittish. It moved as if leading the way, as if it somehow knew the man behind it would follow. Not to hunt, not to photograph, but to understand. The air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and pine resin. David paused briefly and pulled his camera from his backpack. By habit, He lifted the lens, adjusted the aperture, but as he peered through the viewfinder, he did not press the shutter. The fox stood on a rock, bathed in the soft golden light of early morning, its amber red fur glowing like polished stone. But it was its eyes, those eyes, that made his hands falter once more. That look, it was not meant for the camera. It was meant for him. David lowered the camera. He realized he did not want to take this picture, not because it was not beautiful, but because capturing it would trap the moment, imprisoned it like a specimen, and what he truly wanted was to live in it, fully. He whispered, "Where are you trying to lead me?" Of course, the fox did not answer, but once again, it turned, gazed at him for a long time, and silently descended a slope covered in dry leaves. Not running, just walking, like an invitation. David felt his heart pounding. It felt like stepping into a fairy tale, where the main character never knows what awaits beyond the next bend. But like them, he could not stop. Something unseen was pulling him deeper into the forest. Not for his profession, not for a perfect shot, but for something he could not yet name. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Trees stood tall and narrow, packed together like a silent fence. Mud clung to his boots, but he did not care. Every time the fox stopped, turned to look at him, then carried on, David felt a strange swell in his chest. Part unease, part wonder, as if he were being led to a place logic could not reach, but the heart could feel. Then, in a small clearing where sunlight filtered through in golden patches like brushstrokes on canvas, the fox suddenly halted. It stood still, head slightly bound, ears perked, tail fanned out like a cloak draped over its body. David approached, carefully, slowly, and for the first time, the space between them narrowed to just a few yards. His heart pounded, his eyes locked with the fox's. And then, what no one could have predicted, the fox took a single step toward him. Just one step, but it was a step of trust, of beginning, of something extraordinary emerging from behind the veil of the wild. David whispered, perhaps to the creature, perhaps to himself, "You are not afraid of me." But why? At that moment, like a scene in slow motion, the fox turned its head, its eyes clear and bright like spring water running under winter ice, and looked at him once more. No blame, no pleading, just a gaze filled with something that had not yet found words. And then, it turned away, quietly. It continued walking. David watched, his breath caught in his chest. No sound, no clear signal, but in his heart, a soft voice stirred. Follow it, go, not for the photo, not for the story, but because he was being called by life itself. The truth behind the gaze, a wordless plea for help. As the fox led David through the third stretch of forest, the early morning sunlight had already faded beneath the thick canopy. Patches of shadow stretched out like echoes of memory. Dark, yet haunting. Birds had gone quiet, and all that remained were the brittle cracks of dry branches underfoot and the sound of David's own breathing. Heavy with emotion, nearly 3 hours had passed. The path behind them had vanished. No more trail, no more sense of direction. David had no idea where he was within this vast reserve that spanned hundreds of hectares, or over 247 acres. The map in his head was useless now, but he did not turn back, because the fox, it was still moving forward, and each of its steps felt like punctuation in a story yet to be written. Then suddenly, everything changed. The fox stopped cold on a raised patch of ground. Unlike before, it did not look back. It lowered its head, ears pinned, body shrinking in on itself, as if frightened, as if in pain, as if waiting for him to understand what it could not say. David hurried, climbing the small rise, and then he saw it. A narrow crevice, deep, hidden behind a tangle of underbrush like a thin tear between two large rocks. No sound, no sign of life, but the silence itself screamed something urgent. The fox stood right at the edge, peering down carefully, then turned to David, and for the first time, it made a sound, a soft cry, a faint, aching hiss, not a threat, a cry for help. David knelt at the edge. His eyes widened, his breath held. There was movement in the shadows below. He pulled a flashlight from his backpack, aimed it downward, and his heart clenched. Three tiny figures, three fox cubs, huddled together among cold stone, wet dirt, and broken branches. One was breathing rapidly, the other two seemed unconscious from hunger and cold. They were trapped in a space no larger than a grown man's body, buried under debris, perhaps the result of a minor landslide. No way in, no way out. How long had they been down there? David looked up at the mother fox, and finally understood. This was no spirit guide, no silent companion, but a desperate mother seeking a savior for her young. He whispered, as if afraid to break the fragile thread between them, "You brought me here?" The fox did not answer. It simply bowed its head toward the crevice, body trembling, waiting for something uncertain. David removed his backpack, set it down, and knelt at the edge. He estimated the crevice to be about 5 feet deep, or roughly 1.5 meters, just enough to climb into, but tough to climb back out of while carrying an animal. He had to act quickly. There was not much time. Using a rope, he secured himself to the base of a nearby tree and lowered himself into the crevice. Damp, icy air slapped against his skin. The scent of soil, moss, and the faintest trace of blood filled the darkness. Gently, he lifted the first cub, its body light as a feather. Fur soaked through, it opened its eyes, cloudy, but alive. One out, then the second, eyes closed, breath weak, and the third, its hind leg broken, whimpering when he touched it. Above, the mother fox stood silently. She did not step forward. She did not run away. She stood like a statue guarding the last shred of hope in the ancient woods. David wrapped each cub in his extra jacket, laying them gently on the forest floor. He could hardly believe what he had just done. A shift from wildlife photography to an unexpected rescue mission. But something had shifted inside him, as if that very first gaze, back on the foggy mountain road, had planted a silent command in his heart. The mother fox leaned down to sniff each cub, gently licking the forehead of the smallest one. No barking, no howling, just a quiet moment, heavy with meaning, as if to say, thank you for listening." David sat down beside them, exhaling deeply, as his eyes began to sting. He did not know what had made that creature seek out a human, out of all the beings in the forest. But now, that no longer mattered, because he had heard the call, not in words, but through a gaze, through actions, through a strange journey no map could ever chart. And he had answered. Trust beyond boundaries. The early afternoon wind carried a chill in the scent of damp grass, sweeping through the forest like a long, tired sigh from nature itself. On the mossy ground layered with decaying leaves, David knelt beside 3 tiny, flickering lives. The fox cubs, thin, weak, but still breathing, clung to life like glowing embers buried in ash. The mother fox stood nearby, close enough to hear David's breath, but not so close as to frighten herself. That distance, fragile yet intentional, had become sacred now, like a thread connecting 2 worlds, one of human intellect and logic, the other of instinct and ancient silence. David carefully tore strips from his shirt to make a makeshift splint for the cub with the broken leg, stabilizing it the same way he had once learned while helping an injured stray dog at the age of 15. His movements were practiced, but this time, it was more than skill. It was driven by something deeper, quieter, almost like an apology for everything humanity had ever done to this wild world. He slowed his breathing, gently lifting each cub and placing them into a soft fabric sack. The mother fox never looked away. That gaze, no longer wary, no longer afraid, it had transformed into something else. A primal trust, pure and unspoken, but trust like firelight in the dark, flickering, but unmistakably bright. David stood, the weight of 3 fragile lives pressing down on his shoulders. His eyes met the mother fox's. Neither of them moved. The air thickened, time itself seemed to stretch. And then, unexpectedly, the fox took a step forward. No hesitation. David froze. For the first time, the line between man and beast dissolved. There were only 2 beings, both carrying the weight of love and compassion. The fox touched her nose to the edge of the fabric sack. Softly, like a passing breeze, then lifted her head, eyes gleaming with a light that defied description. Was it gratitude, relief, or simply a shared recognition? A mother's look to someone who had saved her world. David tightened his grip on the bag. He spoke quietly, as if afraid to break the moment. "I will get them to safety. I promise." He was not sure if she understood, but she remained there, unmoving. He turned. He began the journey back, each step deliberate, as if he carried the fragile weight of the entire world on his back. And something strange happened. The fox followed, no longer leading, but walking beside him. Each time David paused and looked back, she stopped too. Each time he changed direction, she quietly followed. No sounds, no commands, just presence, a silent reassurance that he was not alone. As they neared the forest edge, David pulled out his phone, intending to check the map for the quickest route back, but remembered there was no signal out here. He did not need it. The fox moved ahead, looked back at him, just briefly, then continued on. She was no longer a desperate mother. She had become a companion. He let her lead, and for the first time in his life, David, the photographer who had tracked African elephants and lain in snow to photograph snowy owls, allowed a wild fox to guide him back to humanity. When the jeep came into view at the forest's edge, the sun had begun to lean westward, casting a golden glow across the thin mist of the late day. David gently placed the 3 cubs in the vehicle, tucking them under a thermal blanket. He turned around. The mother fox stood at the forest's edge. She did not come closer. She did not retreat. She simply watched him. One final look, a farewell with no sound. David opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but nothing came out, because not everything needs to be said. He simply placed his hand over his heart, where it beat with an unfamiliar ache, and nodded. The fox stood a moment longer, then turned and quietly disappeared into the forest. But this time, David knew it was not a goodbye. It was a promise between 2 creatures from 2 different worlds. That sometimes, the deepest connection does not come from being alike, but from the courage to trust. Reunion, not to ask for help, but to say hello. 3 weeks later, winter had begun. As the northern wind swept through, the reserve changed color. Green faded into gold, then into silvery brown. Trees stood bare, the ground was blanketed with fallen leaves, and thin sheets of ice started to edge along the stream banks. David sat in the old wooden cabin he rented whenever he stayed out in the field for extended work. Inside, spread across the table, were printed photos of the fox cubs, now healed and recovering at the Wildlife Rescue Center. The 3 little lives, each had a name now. Ash, the one with the broken leg; Flick, the most energetic; and Willow, the smallest, delicate one with the bright, clear eyes. David had not taken a single photo during the rescue, but the images were burned into his memory, clearer than any photograph he had ever hung in a gallery. He had thought about it every day since, not about the events themselves, but about what lay beneath them. A quiet question, simple yet not easy to answer. Why? Why did a wild fox choose to seek out a human? Why did she not give up? Why did he, a man who always kept emotion at arm's length, cross that invisible line without hesitation? Maybe because every living creature understands hope, and hope, when it has nowhere else to cling to, becomes the boldest act of all. Or maybe because he was finally ready to listen. And then, on a foggy Wednesday morning, when mist once again cloaked the forest's edge like a faded silk curtain, David drove back to that old road. He did not know why. He had no plan. He brought no camera, just a gentle pull, like a call from somewhere he could not name. The jeep rolled past the familiar bend, the place where, weeks ago, headlights had caught a small figure standing in the fog. David had no expectations. He simply stopped the car, opened the door, and stood there, alone, in the cold and stillness. And then, as if the air itself had been holding a secret, a slight movement in the mist made his heart skip. A shape, red, slender, and as the figure stepped from the forest's edge onto the stone-paved road, David knew instantly, it was her, the mother fox, no longer frantic, no longer wearing the look of a creature in distress, but calm, rounded. She stood 10 paces from him. David did not move, he simply stood. They looked at each other. Once more, as if bearing witness to something only they could ever fully understand. No howl, no call, just a gaze, this time, free from worry, free from plea, a greeting, a goodbye, or another beginning. No one could say, but David felt his heart settle. Like a lake gone still after a storm, the fox lingered a few seconds more. The wind tousled the soft fur at her neck, like nature's lightest scarf. Then, having done what she came to do, she turned, slowly, unhurried, as if she knew. David understood now, and for the first time, David felt no need to photograph the moment, because some moments are meant to be kept in the heart, like a beautiful secret nature whispers only to those who know how to listen with their whole soul. A heart that knows how to listen. Winter laid a thin veil of frost over every corner of the reserve. Each morning, the ground iced over in patches, like the wrinkled skin of an aging earth. On bare branches, the mist gathered into heavy droplets, falling silently with the faintest breeze. David stayed, no longer chasing photographs, no longer following a schedule. Each day, he simply stepped out of his cabin, wandered a few paths through the forest, listened to the birds, and watched the smallest movements of nature, as if he himself was now a part of that living web. Neither above nor below it, the 3 fox cubs remained at the rescue center, growing stronger and more playful with each passing day. Willow, the smallest, had begun to run, though with a slight limp. David still visited them often, but he never held them, never stroked their fur. He just stood nearby, watching. Between him and them, there was always a respectful distance, the space between 2 worlds, but also the space where trust lives, a space that does not need to be broken or narrowed, only preserved. One afternoon, as the last light of the day turned the forest amber, David sat on a rock at the trail's edge. He opened his notebook and wrote a few lines. Not work notes, not a journal, but fragments of thought, not yet formed into philosophy. Sometimes, a cry for help does not need a voice. Just a gaze, a step followed, and a heart that knows how to listen. The wind passed through, carrying his words into the forest like a quiet message to creatures he could not see. He looked up, and suddenly, among the scattered trees in the distance, a flicker of red, unclear, uncertain, but he smiled, because he knew, somewhere out there, in this seemingly foreign world, there was a creature who had once placed her entire hope in the hands of a stranger. And that stranger had learned to trust nature again, not with logic, but with the silence of compassion. From that day on, David was no longer just a photographer. He became a storyteller, not with images, but with memory. Stories about eyes in the fog, about wordless looks, about fragile yet enduring trust between 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. And each time he told it, he always ended with one line: nature is not silent, we just need to learn to listen with what cannot be seen. The story closes with the image of the foxes, now grown, darting across the first snow of spring on a gently sunlit day. Their shadows stretched long across the earth like memories, and at the forest's edge, David stood, alone, hands in his pockets, his gaze not searching, just watching, like a gatekeeper to a secret only the old woods and his heart would ever understand.